You're watching the Creator Channel. Please like the video and subscribe.
The fall of Hasdun did not end when the fires died. It travelled west in wagons, in ledges, in chained captives, in sacred vessels wrapped under guard, in stripped bronze, temple screens, worked gold, carved cedar, law scroll chests, merchant hostages, and every rumour that can cling to a victory once men begin telling it in 10 different ports. By the time the first convoy ships crossed the narrow sea under crown banners, the Eastern War had already changed the empire. Crown Hill was no longer receiving mere tribute. It was receiving proof. Proof that King Lionel Baratheon had done what the claimants of the Broken Year could not do, win the throne and then enlarge it. Proof that Prince Steffon Baratheon was not only the king's son, but the man who had taken the sacred city and survived the fire of its inner courts. The city sensed it before the Senate admitted it. The dynasty was no longer provisional. The sacred spoil entered Crown Hill in stages, so the impact would not be lost in one day. First came the standards, then the chained city notables, then the carts bearing bronze gatework and temple fittings, then the long wagons under heavy cloth carrying the wealth of the House of the Covenant. Bells rang from the hill, while crowds packed the streets from river stairs to market arches, and every district tried to push closer for a look at what an Eastern Holy War had brought home. There was one remembered scene that fixed itself in common memory. A black gilded wagon creaked up the slope toward the palace yard, while 4 storm guards walked beside it with drawn swords, and the cloth over the cargo shifted just enough for the crowd below to see hammered gold gleam through smoke and dust. An old woman in the fish market fell to her knees. A senator watching from a balcony did not kneel, but he stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence and never finished it. That was the power of the Hasdun spoil. It silenced as much as it dazzled. King Lionel handled the triumph carefully. He did not let Crown Hill turn the Eastern victory into simple revel. He staged it like statecraft. A portion of the spoils went into the treasury at once. A portion paid the arrears of the men who had won the war. A portion was dedicated to the gods of the realm in a public balancing act, meant to assure Westeros that Eastern wealth had not returned only to corrupt the court again. Then came the deeper move. Lionel used the Hasdun victory to strengthen the empire's frame. The Senate of Crown Hill was broadened in practice, not yet to the later swollen size it would reach in other generations, but enough that Eastern-linked merchants, harbour families, and Braavosi counting men began entering the political air around the hill with more confidence than ever before. At the same time, the King's Council stopped being treated as a wartime convenience. It became permanent. The King's own inner war table of commanders, quartermasters, fleetmen, and trusted lords, the circle beyond the Senate's reach where the real imperial decisions could be made before robes and speeches ever touched them. The young dynasty also gave the victory a body. Prince Steffon Baratheon did not return from Hasdun as a prince among princes. He returned as the Eastern victor, the breaker of the sacred city, and men looked at him differently the moment he dismounted in Crown Hill. He was taller in memory than when he had left, harder in the face, slower to smile, and much more aware of what crowds were taking from him when they stared. In one of the first public appearances after his return, Steffon stood in the palace yard while Eastern captains, Martell envoys, and storm officers were received before the court. He wore a dark war cloak over polished black plate, and the bronze campaign circlet from Hasdun sat in his hands rather than on his head. When a herald named him by all his titles, the city answered louder at the words Prince Steffon Baratheon than it had for the king's opening style. Lionel heard it. So did everyone else. This was good for the realm and dangerous for the household, which is often the same thing. Because while Steffon was becoming unavoidable, another royal son was beginning to take shape in the shadow of all that applause. That boy was Prince Oren Baratheon, younger than his brother, left closer to Crown Hill, while the greater war names were won overseas, and old enough now to understand the difference between being loved by a father and being needed by a dynasty. Oren had not stormed a holy terrace. He had not held a breach against Sarnori lancers. He had not shared the waxboard with Prince Corin Martell of Sunspear beneath oil lamps at midnight. What he had done was survive the bad year in the capital. Watch men lie to each other in silk. Watch kings enter and die and enter again, and learn that power inside Crown Hill did not always look like glory in the field. In those first aftermath months, he was still only a younger prince, but the shape of the later man could already be seen in the way he watched processions, measured speeches, and smiled too little when Stefan's name filled a room. The Hasdan spoil also changed leisure, which in empires is another word for control. King Lionel Baratheon understood that grand victories had to be remembered not only in archives and temple inventories, but in places where the realm could see itself enjoying the peace brought by war. That was where the arena culture deepened. At Prince's Pass, where your later traditions would place it, the first great pass arena was founded in this age as both monument and release valve, a stone fighting ground set near the southern roads where Dornish, Marcher lords, storm captains, and eastern travelers could gather under controlled conditions instead of carrying every rivalry back into camp or court. Lionel approved it as a frontier institution. Half military exercise, half public game, and the money for its first proper build came in part from the eastern treasure taken after Hasdan. The same age saw the beginnings of a second entertainment culture around the capital. Rougher rings in the Kingswood for noble hunts and smaller combats, formalized royal lists and practice enclosures near Crown Hill, and renewed grand bouts at Harrenhal, where the Empire could make a show of strength without always having to start another war. These games were not empty decoration. They became part of politics. A lord might die on a boar hunt in the Kingswood under circumstances no one could prove clean. A hedge champion might make himself famous by beating 3 mailed men beneath the towers of Harrenhal, while half the court watched him through wine cups and private grudges. A prince might choose which fighters to reward and which houses to honor from the gallery, and everyone in attendance would learn something about the next season's balance of favor. Prince Oren understood this far earlier than most men noticed. He watched the games not like a boy dazzled by spectacle, but like someone discovering that arenas, hunts, and public entertainments could be used to shape memory just as surely as a victory on an open field. That was one of the first signs that he would grow into a different kind of ruler than Stefan. The elder brother won loyalty in breach and fire. The younger brother was beginning to understand how a state could be bent through architecture, ceremony, and the public handling of fear. For King Lionel Baratheon, the Hasdan aftermath was the best season of his reign. He had the capital, the eastern glory, the stronger sun, the broadening senate, and an inner council of men he trusted more than the shifting robe factions on the hill. He used the moment well. He restored sections of Crown Hill damaged in the earlier chaos, improved road movement between the Blackwater and the King's Road, strengthened the harbour chain and quays, and tied the eastern war economy into the western capital so efficiently that merchants who had once sneered at military rulers began praising the predictability of Baratheon order. Yet success brings its own strains. The more eastern men thrived in the wake of Hasdan, the more older western houses began muttering that the capital was changing under their feet. The more Stefan's legend grew, the more the younger prince had to decide whether he would accept a supporting role in history or look for a different way to enter. Lionel had won the crownlands. The harder work now lay in teaching a growing empire how to survive the family that had won it. So the aftermath of Hasdan did exactly what a dynasty needs a defining conquest to do. It filled the treasury, enlarged the Senate's world, hardened the king's council, gave rise to permanent arenas and controlled spectacle, and made Prince Stefan Baratheon the next unavoidable figure in the imperial story. At the same time, it planted the younger shadow. Prince Oren Baratheon was still only an observing son in these years, not yet the force he would become, but the empire had begun giving him the materials he would later use: grand buildings, public games, controlled fear, court memory, and the bitterness of growing up beside a brother whose victories sounded louder than his own heartbeat. The years after Hasdun should have belonged entirely to King Lionel Baratheon and then to King Steffon Baratheon. In memory, they almost do. That was part of what shaped the next reign so deeply. While Lionel built the Seven Kingdoms through war, and Steffon returned from the east with the glow of sacred conquest still on him, the younger son, Prince Oren Baratheon, grew up nearer to the corridors, nearer to the whispered bargains, nearer to the chamber doors that opened for one brother with applause, and for the other with a pause. He had seen the battle for Crown Hill from inside. He had seen how fast the Senate of Crown Hill could change its voice, how quickly the City Watch could discover a new conscience after a new king had already won, and how often armed men, not speeches, decided what later became law. Where Steffon learned empire from breach, march, and siege ladder, Oren learned it from watching the capital lie to itself in silk. He was not without affection in youth, but it did not come in the form he most wanted. His father valued him, yet built his future around the elder son. His mother and sister stood closer to him, and for a time that made him softer in private than later enemies would ever admit. But when sickness and court attrition carried off those women who had made the palace bearable to him, the younger prince turned inward in a way other men found unsettling. There were jokes in Crown Hill that if Prince Oren Baratheon could not be found at feast or race, he was alone in some upper chamber with ledgers, maps, or a knife turning over some small object in his hand while he thought. Men laughed at that sort of thing when the elder brother still lived. They stopped laughing after Steffon wore the war circlet at Hasdun, and the whole realm began speaking his name like a coming rain. Oren heard all of it. He forgot none of it. The brief reign of King Steffon Baratheon made the contrast worse before it made it useful. Steffon came to the throne already loved, which is a gift and a trap. He had Hasdun behind him, the Eastern Fire, the soldier's legend, the blackened war cloak stories, the look of a king men believed they already knew. For a little while he justified that hope. He ruled openly, gave audience more freely than his father had, spent from the treasury without wholly abusing it, and let Crown Hill feel that the empire's next age might be strong without being hard. Then the gods, or chance, or the old habit of dynasties to break at exactly the wrong seam, intervened. A fever took him after one season of rule, not on campaign, not in battle, but in the capital itself, and the same city that had shouted his name on the day of return, now listened to the bells in disbelief while the younger brother walked toward a throne he had spent half his life being told existed for someone else. King Oren Baratheon moved quickly after Steffon's death, which later enemies called proof of guilt and wiser men called proof of memory. He had seen what delay did to houses. He had seen claimants lifted on shields and dragged from chambers in the same month, so he did not mourn in a way the singers liked. He secured the crown guard, summoned the Senate, and made the City Watch understand before sunset that there would be no bad year reborn merely because the beloved brother had died first. One of the first things he did was bind the dead more tightly to the living crown. King Lionel Baratheon and King Steffon Baratheon were elevated in cult, image, and monument, not just praised as worthy kings, but set in the public life of the realm as sacred pillars of the new order. Oren wanted every lord in Westeros to understand that the Baratheon line was no accident of victory. It was destiny made hereditary. He also made plain at once that he would not rule like his father or brother. He did not pretend that the Senate of Crown Hill shared rule. He did not flatter old robe men into believing their objections were part of the process. He sat where kings sat, listened when he chose, and then gave the order he had already decided on. In one of the first great Senate disputes of his reign, Senator Giles Gaunt of Rosby rose to complain that the king was reducing the old body to ceremony and record-keeping. Orrin let him speak, let 2 other old houses nod along, then called up Senator Maro Antarion of Bravos, a narrow-faced lender and shipping man newly raised into the chamber, and asked him how long-grain convoys would keep sailing if every vote had to wait on wounded pride. Maro answered in his accented common tongue that ships obey tides faster than speeches, and when the chamber hissed at him for it, King Orrin Baratheon smiled once and declared that the empire had grown too large to be governed as if only old blood could count. That was the new rule in one exchange. The Senate would remain, but it would no longer be mistaken for the source of power. This was also when the empire began to look fully imperial in composition, not only in reach. The Senate of Crown Hill still held old names, Rosby, Massey, Sunglass, Valerian, Stokeworth, but now new men sat among them, whose grandfathers would never have expected such a place. Senator Maro Antarion of Bravos represented fleet credit, customs, and eastern grain. Senator Bernard Manderley of White Harbor came wrapped in northern wool, and smelled faintly of cold halls and sea salt, even in summer, a reminder that frontier logistics could now raise a man as surely as court birth. There were rivermen, harbormen, lesser knights raised through administrative work, and bastard-born officials whose loyalty belonged first to the king who had made them. Old lords hated the look of it, and could not argue with the results. For the first time, the chamber on the hill began to look less like a surviving club of Crownland grandees, and more like a ruling organ of a realm that stretched past old habits and into full empire. Orrin then gave himself the tool he needed to shape that empire permanently. He took the office of Master of Rolls and Conduct for Life, a title that sounded dry enough to pass one room and mattered enough to master 3 others. Through it, he could review appointments, expel or elevate senators, police public morality, and reach into the personal behavior of the ruling class without having to ask the ruling class for permission first. The old houses called it tyranny disguised as bookkeeping. The common people called it overdue. Adulterers of rank were exiled. Bribe-taking magistrates were stripped. A juror of high family lost his place after abusing his office in a marriage suit he thought beneath notice. One lord was publicly removed for hiring players to mock the war dead at Hasdon during a drunken revel. The noble class discovered that the new king hated corruption, vanity, and inherited impunity in almost equal measure. He was harder on money than the last few reigns had been, and more serious about what money meant. Orrin refused the lazy trick of cheapening the coinage to make obligations look smaller. He restored weight and purity where he could, then forced the realm to pay honestly for what it wanted. That meant taxes landed sharper, customs were collected more ruthlessly, and confiscations became a tool not only of punishment but of policy. The building program that followed was immense. Crown Hill rose in dressed stone and disciplined geometry over the loose scars of earlier chaos. Processional ways were widened. New porticos, archives, audience halls, shrines, and barracks were built or rebuilt. At Harrenhal, the games were enlarged into a more formal cycle, with fixed seating, royal boxes, controlled entry, and armored bouts that let the empire watch itself turning violence into spectacle. In the south, the first true stone arena at Prince's Pass was laid out under royal sanction, not just a fighting ground, but an institution. He loved structure and feared decay, which made him both effective and exhausting. A king like Orrin could not see a half-working drain, a half-disciplined office, or a half-police district without wanting to drive an iron rod through the middle of it and make it stand upright. The Kingswood was reorganized into royal hunting circuits and restricted reserves, which did not stop suspicious deaths there, but did make them easier for the court to deny. Crown Hill's ward records were redrawn. Grain tallies were audited. Port books were compared against actual holds instead of noble assurances. The realm prospered in ways many men preferred not to admit, because prosperity under a king they hated only deepened the insult. That was the paradox of Orrin's middle years. He made the machine work better, while making the people at the top of it dream of killing him. He also wanted the one thing denied him in youth, unanswerable military glory. The first attempt came on the northeastern march, where mountain clans and ridge raiders had been harrying caravan roads and royal surveyors sent to extend fort lines and watchtowers. Oren went in person, built roads, raised stockades, and returned to Crown Hill with enough prisoners and banners to stage a triumph, though nearly everyone who knew the front well understood that the campaign had been more about imposing order than breaking a great enemy. He celebrated anyway. The city got games, handouts, songs, and polished armor in procession. The soldiers got a pay raise, which they liked more than the song. The aristocracy muttered that it was a hollow victory. Oren heard them, remembered them, and began wanting a war no one could dismiss. That war found him in the river corridor. West of the Trident, along the scarred country where Harrenhal cast its black reach over road, ford, and field, the Iron Islands' interest had not died with earlier failures. Hoar blood still moved through that lane, half in garrisons, half in river-client houses, and under King Harwin Hoare of Harrenhal, the Iron Men began consolidating forts, tribute rights, and local loyalties into something larger than raiding. Oren first drove them back, and celebrated too soon. Then one of his chosen commanders, Lord Simon Riker of Maidenpool, pushed too hard into the narrows above the Red Fork and was cut to pieces in an ambush that cost the crown a field host, a standard, and much of its recent bragging. Oren returned in fury, reorganized the frontier, split commands, added new river defenses, and eventually won back honor in a harder second campaign that broke Harwin's field strength without destroying his state outright. But just as the king prepared to press farther, another crisis opened behind him, and he chose the thing later critics would never forgive. He made peace, recognized the Hoare River State in reduced form, and sent money, artisans, and supervised works into the corridor so the frontier would hold without swallowing more years. The walls later, kings would bleed against, began rising with crown help under Oren's treaty. The revolt that followed came from the northern river line, where resentment had been hardening under too much watchtower duty, too many reorganizations, and too much fear that the king was turning every frontier commander into a clerk in armor. Lord Raymond Riker of the Upper Trident, no close kin to the dead Simon, but eager to wear grievance like inheritance, refused the royal oath renewal and expected support from across the water and frozen ford. He misjudged the season, and the man sent against him. An early thaw broke the crossings he had counted on, leaving his allies stranded and his rebellion exposed before it had fully found its feet. The crown response was swift and disciplined, and among the commanders who stood out in that suppression was Lord Gerald Dane of Starfall, whose forced march, steadiness under strain, and refusal to waver once the order was given put him high in royal favor. Oren promoted him fast afterward, gave him a greater seat at council, and in doing so planted the first real marker for the age to come. Yet the revolt changed the king more than the promotion healed him. After that year, King Oren Baratheon trusted less and punished more. Treason cases multiplied. Confiscations came faster. Men of senatorial rank began disappearing into exile, forced suicide, or midnight arrest with disturbing regularity. Some were guilty, some were merely convenient. The chamber on the hill feared him now, with its whole body. He feared it back with his whole mind. There were days when Oren could still preside brilliantly over building plans in the morning, hear fiscal disputes by midday, and watch mounted games by dusk, as if his reign were broad, ordered, and fully under control. Then came the darker hours, when he wanted to know which governor wrote too warmly to which senator, which household slave had been bribed, which niece, widow, or rival cousin might become the center of the next plot if left unwatched. Paranoia did not arrive out of nowhere. It hardened from memory into method. In the last years, the court became a place of polished dread. His wife, Queen Bethadane of Starfall, remained personally loyal and publicly dignified, though even that loyalty could not soften the atmosphere around the king. The younger administrative men he had raised loved him, or feared him enough to imitate love. The soldiers still admired much about him, especially the pay, the seriousness, and the refusal to let old robe blood govern over their heads. The Senate loathed him almost to a man. When the end came, it came the way such reigns often do, by a plot born inside the household, rather than beyond the walls. A chamberlain, a palace servant with access, and a family attendant working under borrowed innocence brought a blade close enough to the king to finish what years of muttering had never dared attempt in public. Oren fought for his life harder than the plotters expected. He died under repeated blows in his private rooms after wounding the first attacker and trying to reach for the weapon that should have been beneath his hand. By sunset, the men who had trembled under him were already speaking of liberty. The next day, the Senate of Crown Hill chose relief over caution and raised King Williman Rosby, an old political survivor of Crown Hill, a man of shadows, courtesy, and careful friendships, whose long talent had been living through the falls of louder men. Williman was not a war king. He was not even a man the soldiers would have picked if given a free shout on an open field. He was the kind of ruler old nobles choose when they want to believe that killing one hard king can rewind time. It could not. The Senate cheered too quickly. The soldiers grieved Oren more honestly than the lords expected. The crown guard was uncertain, the city watch divided, and the outer armies were already asking whether the old man on the throne could command anything stronger than a chamber vote. Williman understood this faster than the men who had lifted him. And as he looked across the board for the one figure the armies might accept, his eyes kept returning to Lord Gerald Dane of Starfall, the frontier commander who had marched when others hesitated, obeyed when others schemed, and whose name had begun rising for the same reason most imperial names rise. The realm had started saying it before the court had officially chosen it. The First Baratheon Age hardened the palace, enlarged the empire's administrative class, broadened the Senate even while stripping it of meaning, gave the realm arenas, roads, taxes, moral laws, stronger coin, cleaner offices, bitter nobles, and a frontier peace that would one day demand a harsher answer. It also left behind the exact kind of succession problem that turns one era into the staging ground for the next. King Williman Rosby now sits where a murdered strong king sat before him, and the question hanging over Crown Hill is not whether the Senate has won, but whether it can survive until it finds a soldier the armies will love more than the dead. That is where the next phase begins, with an old court king trying to steady the center, and with Lord Gerald Dane of Starfall waiting somewhere beyond it, not yet crowned, but already moving closer to the shape of destiny. When King Williman Rosby of Crown Hill took the throne, the city did not celebrate so much as exhale. He was old enough to look safe, courteous enough to calm rooms, and careful enough to understand that a king raised by frightened senators is never truly their master, only their answer to the fear of a harder man. Yet the empire had grown too wide, too rich, and too entangled for an answer like that to last long on courtesy alone. Crown Hill was no longer merely a hill city with a crown over the Blackwater. It was the hinge of tolls, harbour chains, convoy rights, customs, river passage, debt settlements, and war contracts from the narrow sea to the southern routes that reached towards Sothorios and the deeper eastern lanes beyond Meereen and Hazdan. To sit the Crown Land's throne now meant more than wearing a crown. It meant deciding which house paid less at the quays, which house gained a charter on the eastern sea road, which captains guarded the spice route, which family got tax relief on Volantine cloth or Sothoriosi hardwood, and which lord found his fortunes collapsing because the king closed one gate, favored one convoy, or shifted one customs post. In earlier ages, houses rose by swords alone. In Williman's day, they could rise by ships, grain, port books, and the king's signature just as easily. That was why the seat mattered so much, and why so many kinds of men now believed they had a claim to it. Blood still mattered first in the songs, but in the chambered truth of empire, blood was only one door. Service to the realm could raise a man. A frontier command held well could raise him. Vast wealth, if spent at the right hour on the right captains and the right senators, could bring him within reach of kingship, even if older lords sneered at the way he had come. The realm had already seen enough in one lifetime to understand the lesson. A bastard war prince had become a king by usefulness. A noble claimant had been crowned through charm and camp bargain. A hard commander had taken the empire by force. A younger son had mastered it through method, discipline, and fear. Now an old court survivor sat the throne by consensus, and every watching house understood that the crownland's crown was the richest and most dangerous prize in the world because it could make a middling house great or drag a great one down into debt, scandal, and extinction inside 2 reigns. Williman had the sense to speak that truth softly before the Senate of Crown Hill, rather than pretend it did not exist. In one of the first major disputes of his reign, Senator Mauro Antarion of Bravos argued for lower customs on eastern convoy traffic, saying the empire could take less on each ship and gain more through volume, loyalty, and secure passage. Senator Bernard Manderley of White Harbor answered that grain fleets and northern timber were already paying for southern luxury twice over and would not bear another adjustment made to please harbor lenders. Then rose Senator Harwood Celtiger of Claw Isle, who asked the older question beneath both complaints. What exactly was the king selling when he sold favor in taxes, the good of the realm or the standing of houses? Williman listened long enough to let the room believe it was shaping policy, then said the one line that stayed with men afterward. He told them the king of the crown lands did not merely rule land, he ruled access, and access was what made or unmade families now. The chamber fell quiet after that because every man in it knew he was right. The Senate itself was changing fast enough that older men could feel the floor moving beneath their seats. The old Crownland lines still sat there in silk and chain, but beside them now were newer faces who carried the look of the larger empire. Senator Mauro Antarion of Bravos, with his ledgers, shipping law, and fleet credit. Senator Bernard Manderley of White Harbor and Northern Wool, broad-handed and blunt, more likely to speak of cold harbors and frontier costs than marble dignity. Senator Kyle Santagar of Spotswood, speaking for the southern roads and dry country caravan rights that had grown more important since Hasdon opened the east wider. There were rivermen, customs men, war clerks made noble by use, and harbor lords whose grandfathers would once have been admitted only through side doors. The old senators hated the smell of change. The empire needed it. That was the contradiction Williman had to govern. A chamber growing broader, even as its pride remained narrow. He understood quickly that the throne he wore could not be secured by the Senate that had raised him. So while he soothed the capital, he also reached outward toward the one man whose name carried weight with the armies, Lord Gerald Dane of Starfall. Gerald had not yet been crowned, but his reputation had already gone ahead of him through the frontier lines, through the River War, and through the memory of the last reign's hardest campaigns. He had the kind of standing that makes soldiers straighten when his name is read in orders, and the kind of restraint that makes noble houses think they might still survive his rise. Williman began honoring him without crowning him, widening his command, sending him to review the river corridor, and letting it be known that the crown trusted him in the places where treaties were weakest and walls were newest. It was a careful balance. Too little favor, and Gerald might become the army's grievance. Too much, and the capital would realize the old king was introducing his own replacement to the board. The river frontier gave Williman the language he needed to explain kingship to the realm without sounding like a teacher. When reports came in from the Harrenhal corridor and the half-subdued lands where Ironborn influence still tangled with river loyalties, the king held open councils and asked the simplest question first: why does this strip of land matter enough to keep bleeding over? The answers did the work for him. It mattered, because whoever held those crossings controlled tolls, grain movement, levy roads, and the trade that linked the Trident to Crown Hill. It mattered because a lord granted relief from river tariffs under royal favour could enrich his sons in 10 years, while a rival cut off from those same routes might sell daughters, castles, and swords just to stay upright. It mattered because the empire did not live only in banners and law. It lived in bridges, ferries, river forts, bonded warehouses, custom sheds, convoy escorts, and the quiet royal decrees that told merchants which seal would open a gate faster than another. Every house listening understood then why men killed for the crownland's throne, even when they claimed to be saving the realm from ambition. Williman also began using the King's Council more deliberately than the Senate liked. He kept the robed men talking on the hill, while real military and trade questions went to smaller rooms with fewer witnesses, where Lord Gerald Dane of Starfall, Lord Denis Velaryon of Driftmark, Lord Tytos Lannister, and selected harbour and treasury men could speak plainly. There the issue was never abstract. A tax break for one Western fleet house might secure 10 more convoy hulls on the eastern route. A reduction on Volantine customs might pull merchants toward Crown Hill and away from rival ports. A new charter touching Sothriosi cargoes, timber, dyes, strange beasts, rare hides, and black market medicines, might make one house rich enough to marry upward and another desperate enough to plot. That was what imperial rule meant now. The king sat at the crossing point between war and wealth, and whichever house held him closest could turn policy into legacy. Whichever house angered him might discover that decline begins with a ledger entry long before it shows itself as ruin in stone. All of this made Williman's reign more important than later songs would admit. He was not a conquering figure. He was not a bright young legend. He was the old bridge king who kept the structure from shaking itself apart long enough for the next true builder to step onto it. And while he did that, Lord Gerald Dane of Starfall kept growing in the background, not through theatrical boasts, but through command, reliability, and the confidence of men who had grown tired of palace accidents deciding the fate of armies. In one final Senate dispute before the season turned, Senator Maro Antarion of Bravos remarked that an empire this large could no longer be ruled as a family estate. Senator Bernard Manderley of White Harbour replied that perhaps it had already ceased being one the day northern and eastern men started paying for southern crowns. Williman let them argue, then looked down the chamber and said that was exactly why the throne could now be reached by blood, by service, or by wealth, but only held by a ruler who understood how to master all three. In that answer, he was not describing himself. He was describing the man the realm was already drifting toward. King Williman Rosby began his reign by doing exactly what the Senate of Crown Hill wanted, and exactly what the armed men of the realm hated. He ended the harsher prosecutions of the last reign, recalled a few exiles, restored confiscated lands where it suited him, and let the chamber on the hill feel for a brief season as if it had finally stepped back into the center of power. But the city garrison, the crown guard, and the out-of-field hosts did not see a graceful restoration in any of that. They saw an old Senate king protecting the men who had stabbed King Oren Baratheon in his own rooms, and then asking the realm to call that peace. Williman tried silver first, gifts for the guard, relief for the capital, and kind words for wounded pride, yet all of it landed weakly. A king raised by robes had bought himself a seat, but not yet the right to sit easy in it. The breaking point came inside Crown Hill itself. The Crown Guard did not openly revolt, but they made the palace understand that their loyalty was conditional by locking down the inner approaches and refusing to disperse until the chief plotters against Oren had been surrendered. The city watch of Crown Hill, always eager to arrive second and declare itself first, hovered between obedience and opportunism, while the Senate chamber pretended to still be debating principle. For one hard day and night, the old king was effectively trapped in his own seat, taking messages through guarded doors, while armed men in black and gold crown cloaks and dull red city cloaks glared across the same courtyards. Williman yielded in the only way left to him. Some of Oren's killers were handed over for execution, others for exile, and the old king learned what every ruler after the Baratheon founders would have to learn again. The Crown Land's throne could be granted by the Senate, but it could not be kept without the men who held steel for it. That was when the matter of succession stopped being theoretical. Williman was old, childless in the line that mattered, and too shrewd to believe he could leave the empire to chance after what he had just survived. So the names began moving through the rooms. Senator Maro Antarion of Bravos favored a harbor prince who would protect loans and sea routes. Senator Bernard Manderley of White Harbor argued for a hard frontier man who could command respect outside Crown Hill. Old Crownland houses muttered for one of their own, while newer imperial men quietly counted which commander the armies would actually follow if another season of confusion opened. In the end, the answer was the same in barracks, river camps, and roadside forts. Lord Gerald Dane of Starfall. The name had already outrun the debate. Williman did not invent it. He surrendered to it with dignity. The adoption of Lord Gerald Dane of Starfall was staged with all the quiet statecraft the moment required. No festival excess, no overbright silks, no false claim that the Senate had freely designed the future from pure wisdom. The old king called the chamber, the crown guard lined the black steps, and Gerald entered beneath the lilac and dawn colors of House Dane, the white sword and falling star bright on a pale field that looked almost too clean for the room it was entering. Williman named him son and heir, not only in blood law fiction, but in duty, command, and expectation. Gerald bent the knee, took the old king's hand, and did not overplay the moment. That restraint mattered. The Senate disliked being overawed. The soldiers disliked being lied to. Gerald's great early strength was that he usually gave each side just enough of what it needed to keep moving. He was not a court ornament dragged in from a safe hall. By then Lord Gerald Dane of Starfall had already made his name on the harder lanes of the realm. He had held the upper river line after Oren's treaty with the Hoare state turned brittle. He had marched in the Northern River Revolt, and come back with his standards intact. He had the respect of Dornish captains who did not flatter easily, and the wary approval of Stormland officers who judged men by whether they held their line in rain and mud. His war following looked like the Empire in miniature. At his core were about 1,800 Dane men from Starfall and the Torrentine Road. Lavender surcoats, pale cloaks, white sword and star banners, mailed spears in the front, and 600 mounted retainers behind. With them rode Lord Kyle Santagar of Spotswood, with 400 spotted spear men in the white and red colours of his house, Lord Cletus Jourdain of the Tor, with 300 dry country riders in ochre and sand, and Lord Ulwick Blackmont, with 500 dark-cloaked mountain men who fought on foot with spear and falchion. That was only the southern blade. The imperial edge came from elsewhere. When Gerald took the river review for the crown, he did not go north with a Dornish host alone. He went with a combined imperial command so the whole realm could see what the future looked like in arms. Joining him were 1,000 Stormlanders under Lord Gawain Morrigan of Crow's Nest, black crows on green and yellow, hard shield infantry, and 200 mailed horse. 700 Crownland spears came from Rosby, Stokeworth, and Hayford, under Lord Morin Gaunt of Rosby. In sober blacks, reds, and dusty golds, more garrison men than heroes, but steady in formation. Lord Denis Valerian of Driftmark brought 300 river marines and boatmen under silver seahorse banners on sea green, useful wherever crossing points, fireships, or bridgework mattered. From the west rode Lord Tytos Lannister with 600 armoured retainers in crimson and gold, fewer in number than the songs later made them, but heavy enough to split a wavering line if timed well. When the host moved along the trident roads, watchers could read the Empire in its colours before they knew its purpose. Lilac Dane, black stag standards borrowed from the older Baratheon armories, green and yellow storm banners, sea-green Valerian cloth, crimson Western knights, all of it moving under the authority of one old king and one chosen heir. What Geralt found on that inspection made his later reputation inevitable. The hoar frontier west of Harrenhal had thickened into something more dangerous than raiding, and more durable than a temporary border quarrel. King Harwin Hoare of Harrenhal had used the peace bought under Oren to strengthen river forts, timber stockades, and floodbank walls, all tied together by beacon mounds and barge routes that ran along the God's Eye and into the western channels. The black and iron longship standards still flew over the stronger towers, but the force behind them was no longer purely island-born. There were river levies, in mud red and green, hired axemen from the lakeshore, and ironborn officers training local spearmen to hold ditches and gate cuts instead of charging like raiders. Geralt studied the line and understood at once what the late King Oren had understood too late and too privately. This was not a nuisance. This was a real rival state growing at the Empire's waist, and every year it stood unbroken. It taught the Riverlands that Crown Hill's reach had limits. He did not rush into a grand invasion, and that caution made some young lords call him timid until time proved them fools. Instead, Geralt spent the season measuring roads, fort depths, ferry width, grain distance, and how many men each allied house could actually keep in the field past the first month without stripping its homelands bare. He rode the dike roads in lighter armor, spoke with captains at bridgeheads, watched the black water under Harrenhal's shadow, and questioned every scout who had seen the Hoare line from close ground rather than from rumor. One camp scene from that year became famous later. Geralt standing beside a mud table under a rain-hung awning, one gauntlet off, his finger tracing the line between the trident and the God's Eye, while Lord Gawain Morrigan, Lord Dinis Valerian, and Lord Tytos Lannister argued over whether the first blow should fall at the ferry towers, the river palisades, or the hill forts behind them. Geralt listened until they had all finished, then said the Empire would not win this front by hitting what looked proudest. It would win by cutting what fed it. That answer pleased King Williman Rosby greatly, which was one reason the old king lasted long enough to die in his bed instead of under a knife. He had chosen a soldier, yes, but he had chosen a soldier who understood administration, movement, and how crowns are really held together in his final year. Williman made sure the realm saw more of Geralt without feeling that he had vanished into his own successor's shadow. The old king still took the chair in Crown Hill. Geralt held the roads, the reviews, the frontier discipline, and the confidence of men who preferred their future with a sword at its side. When Williman died of fever after a short and tense reign, there was grief enough for decency, but not enough to slow the machinery. The crown passed cleanly. That alone made the moment seem miraculous to men who remembered the bad years. And when King Gerald Dane of Starfall entered Crown Hill afterward, he did so on foot through the city gates rather than in a gilded litter, greeting the people as he came, letting the city see that the Empire had chosen not a palace phantom, but a working king.